A pleasant day to everyone. I am Shekinah Niog, and today we'll be discussing about Gordon Allport's theory, which is the psychology of the individual. His theory is mainly part of the dispositional theories, and before we start our discussion about the psychology of the individual, let us have a little recapitulation as to what dispositional theories are. Dispositional theories are also called as trait theories. They are the class of theory which argue that unique and long-term tendencies to behave in particular ways are the essence of our personality. It focuses more on analyzing the structure of personality by measuring, identifying, and classifying similarities and differences in personality characteristics or traits. Dispositional theories, in accordance to its definition, focus more on the measurement of traits which, for trait theorists, lead to a better understanding of personality. So that is what dispositional theories are. It is basically describing core personality traits of a person and explain how these traits shape or affect the personality of that person. Moving on, we can see the outline of our discussion on ALLPORT's theory. So the first to be discussed is the overview of ALLPORT's psychology of the individual, which will then be followed by Gordon Allport's biography. Third in line is Allport's approach to personality theory, and lastly, we have the structure of personality. Right now, we'll be tackling about the overview of Allport's psychology of the individual. So Allport emphasized the uniqueness of an individual and believed that attempts to describe people in general traits rob them of their unique individuality. So si Allport, he believed that once we try to describe daw an individual based on general traits or yung traits that are quite common for everybody, we are robbing them of their unique individuality or their distinction from other people. So since si Allport put so much emphasis on each person's uniqueness, he then conducted an in-depth study of a single individual. He then called the study of the individual as morphogenic science and contrasted it with the nomothetic methods used by most other psychologists. So since Allport wanted to focus on studying a single individual, he preferred to use morphogenic science. He used morphogenic science mainly because it deals with various methods of gathering data on patterns of behavior within a single individual. So if we try to compare these two, the morphogenic and nomothetic methods, we can see that morphogenic science or methods focuses more on a single individual or person, whereas the nomothetic methods focus more on people in general, meaning their means of gathering data are based on groups of people. Also, the reason why Allport prefer morphogenic methods over nomothetic ones is because nomothetic methods approach in studying personality is based on general laws or principles, which does not fit into Allport's desire to study an individual, kay nomothetic is more on the general laws man God and principles. So that is the reason why. So Allport was eclectic in building his theory and accepted some of the contributions of Freud, Maslow, Rogers, Eysenck, Skinner, and others. When we say eclectic, it is basically an approach that allows selection of usable elements from different sources or different theories or approaches and combines them in a unified manner. So we can see here that before Allport came up with his own theory, he studied personality from different sources first and used some concepts from those sources to build up his own personality theory. And although Allport acknowledged some concepts from the theories of those psychologists above, he believed that no one among those is able to adequately explain the total growing and unique personality. So for Allport, a broad, comprehensive theory is preferable to a narrow, specific theory even if it does not generate as many testable hypotheses. So para kay Allport, mas preferable daw yung broad and comprehensive na theory kaysa sa theory na narrow and specific kahit na hindi masyado nagja-generate ng testable hypothesis iyang comprehensive na theory. Right now, we'll be discussing about Gordon Allport's biography. So his full name is Gordon Willard Allport. He was an American psychologist that was born on November 11, 1897 in Montezuma, Indiana. He was the youngest son of John Allport, a physician, and Nellie Weiss Allport, which was a former school teacher. He was able to meet Sigmund Freud in Vienna at the age of 22. When Alport returned in the United States, he completed his PhD degree at Harvard and studied under the great German psychologists Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, William Stern, Heinz Werner, and others. In 1925, he married Ada Lofkin-Gold and had only one child, Robert Alport, who became a pediatrician and thus sandwiched Alport between two generations of physicians. In 1939, he was elected as president of the American Psychological Association, and in 1967, since Alport was a heavy smoker, he died due to lung cancer. So I guess that's all for the biography of Gordon Allport. Now, let us proceed to Allport's approach to personality theory. So there are three main questions or interrelated questions that would reveal Allport's approach to personality theory once answered. The first question is, what is personality? So like any other psychologists who have struggles in defining personality, naglisod sad og define ani si Allport. Before he came up with his recent definition of personality, he traced first the etymology of the word persona, which, if you try to recall chapter 1, mani siya ang theatrical masks na ginasuot sa mga Roman actors in Greek dramas. And being able to extract the Greek roots of persona, he then spelled out 49 other definitions of personality as used in different disciplines. And literally, it just took him 49 definitions of personality before he came up with his 50th definition of personality, which is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his unique adjustment to his environment. But 24 years after he offered his 50th definition of personality, iyang giilisan ang last phrase into that determine his characteristics, behavior, and thought. So his definition was now changed into the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine his characteristic, behavior, and thought. This change in the definition is vital to really understand Allport's point when it comes to his own definition and understanding of personality. Kaya ang phrase man God na adjustments to his environment, it could simply imply that it was the people who are adjusting or adapting to the environment, which basically is not the point Allport wanted to give emphasis to. Now, with his revised definition, Allport is trying to say that behavior is expressive as well as adaptive. Dili lang kay ang tao ang nag-adjust to his environment, but it also reflects, meaning, once we adapt to our environment, it reflects to us in such a way that our environment adjusts to us too. And what Allport is implying is that behavior is dynamic. It is not just you who are adjusting to the environment, but it is also the other way around. Now let us try to understand further the definition of personality according to Allport. So the term dynamic organization implies an integration or interrelatedness of the various aspects of personality. With this, Allport emphasized that personality is not a static organization. Rather, it is constantly growing or changing. Next, the term psychophysical emphasized the importance of both the psychological and physical aspect of personality. Neither psychological nor physical aspects is greater or less than the other. That is why Allport stressed here that both these, the psychological and physical, are equally important. So the next one is determine, which means that personality is something that does something. In simpler words, Allport regarded determine here as an indicator that personality, hindi lang siya yung mask na sinusuot during drama, or hindi lang siya purely rotating sa notion na it is somewhat related sa behavior natin, and What Allport meant here is personality is much more than just a mask. It is what the person is behind the action or behind the drama, and personality is basically what the person is behind the scenes. So the next one is characteristic, which Allport implied to as individual or unique. And according to Allport, we are all marked with a unique engraving, a stamp, or marking no one else can duplicate. So for Allport, we all have that characteristic that distinguishes us from others. That characteristic na maingon nato na kani siya na tao lahi na siya sa kato siyang isa. Or kani siya na tao is different from that person. So the next one are the terms behavior and thought, which simply means to anything a person does. So these are omnibus terms that is meant to include our behaviors, thoughts, as well as our words and actions. This just literally means everything that we do from thinking up to doing and expressing what we wanted to do so. With this, Allport's definition suggested that human beings are both product and process, that they have an organized structure, yet they are also open to changes. In summary, personality is both physical or psychological. It includes both overt behaviors and covert thoughts. Personality is not only something, but rather, it does something. So now let us proceed to the second question that would lead us to Allport's approach to personality theory. The question is, what is the role of conscious motivation? So, more than any other personality theorist, Allport emphasized the importance of conscious motivation. So his emphasis on conscious motivation goes back to his meeting in Vienna with Freud and his reaction towards Freud's question, "And the little boy was you?" in which Allport insisted that, contrary to Freud's assumption, his motivation is quite conscious. So why did Allport said that his motivation is conscious? So now, if you try to recall when Allport met Freud in his office, he told Freud about a young boy na nakita niya sa tram car, which obviously had a dirt phobia. Now, Freud would assume that there is an underlying unconscious reason or unconscious meaning to the story of the boy. But for Allport, he knows exactly that he just simply wants to know the ideas of Freud about dirt phobia in a child so young. So with this, he insisted that his motivation in line to know the boy's story or in line to know Freud's ideas on the boy's story is quite conscious. So this is where it all started, that Allport advocated a proactive position, one that emphasized the notion that people are largely motivated by their consciousness, a claim that is completely opposite to Freud's notion that we are driven by our unconscious impulses and motives. So, despite his strong emphasis on conscious motivation, Allport did not ignore the existence or even the importance of unconscious processes to human thought and behavior. So he believed, for example, that most compulsive behaviors are automatic repetitions and is usually self-defeating and motivated by unconscious tendencies. Now let us forward to the last question in knowing Allport's approach on his personality theory, which are the characteristics of a healthy person. In here, he identified 6 criteria for the mature personality. First is an extension of the sense of self, which means that a mature person continually involves himself in activities and even problems that are not self-centered. They are not egocentric and give no unselfish interest in work, play, and recreation, and rather they give utmost importance to family, society, and spiritual life. The second criterion is that mature personalities are characterized by a warm relating of self to others. This means that mature personalities are able to relate themselves to others in an intimate and compassionate manner. They are also able to respect people and love them non possessively and unselfishly. So the third one is emotional security or self acceptance. This criterion, according to ALLPORT, means that psychologically mature people are able to accept themselves for who they truly are. They also do not get easily discouraged and irritated when things doesn't go the way they planned it to be. So the fourth one is that psychologically healthy people also possess a realistic perception of their environment. Ito yung klase ng tao na they do not live on fantasy, but rather they are realistic. They see their surroundings or environment in a realistic manner, and they are also problem-oriented and not self-centered. So the fifth one is insight and humor, which means that mature individuals have clear-cut idea about their own strengths and weaknesses. Humor, as seen by ALLPORT here, is our ability to laugh at things that we love most, which also includes even our own personality. So that's for insight and humor. And the last one, the final criterion of ALLPORT's characteristic of a healthy person is a unifying philosophy of life. In this, people are able to see the whole picture owing to their ability to regularly single out the important things in their own life. They also tend to have known the purpose of their life when they reach this criterion. So that's the characteristics of a healthy person according to ALLPORT. So right now we are at the structure of personality. This is the last topic that we'll be discussing, and the structure of personality is basically the basic units or the building blocks of personality. So for Freud, it was the instincts that were the basic units of personality. For Eysenck, it is the biologically determined factors. However, for ALLPORT, the basic units of personality is personal dispositions. So here in the next slide, we can see here the common traits and personal dispositions. So ALLPORT was very careful when it comes to defining, and he was very careful when it comes to segregating these two, or what's the difference between these two. So common traits are basically the general characteristics shared by many, whereas the personal dispositions are otherwise called as the individual traits are a generalized neuropsychic structure peculiar to the individual with the capacity to render many stimuli functionally equivalent and to initiate and guide consistent forms of adaptive and stylistic behavior. So, personal dispositions or individual traits are basically yung anong meron sa'yo na wala sa iba. So, this is kind of different from the common traits. Kay common traits is held in common by many people, whereas personal dispositions, these are traits that are only found in an individual or peculiar only to the individual. So here we can see that there are three levels of personal dispositions. The first one is the cardinal disposition. The second is the central disposition. And the third one is the secondary disposition. So we'll be elaborating these three in the next slides. So the first level of personal dispositions is the cardinal dispositions. These are an eminent characteristic, a ruling passion so outstanding it dominates the lives of those who possess this. So cardinal dispositions are dominating. That is why when people have this, you you will really know that she possesses cardinal dispositions, because these are traits that are thought to be quite rare too. But these dispositions are strongly deterministic of behavior. So most people do not have a cardinal disposition due to the fact that it is rare. But those few people who do are often known by that single characteristic. So I have here an examples, or a list of examples on cardinal dispositions. We have here quixotic, narcissistic, sadistic, altruistic, chauvinistic, a Don Juan, and so on. So an example of a quixotic person is Don Quixote. He was only the person who is truly, or who was truly, a quixotic. And narcissistic, an example of a narcissistic person is Narcissus. He was only the one that was completely narcissistic. So the last examples of, or the last example of cardinal disposition is altruistic. So when we say altruistic, the first to come in our minds is Mother Teresa, because she possessed these traits of being an altruistic, or as we know, she is an advocate of altruism. That is why it is considered as her cardinal dispositions, because she is only one of those few people who have the characteristic of being an altruistic person. So the second level of personal disposition is the central dispositions. These are present to all varying degrees in all people and include 5 to 10 most outstanding characteristics around which all person's life focuses. These are seen as core traits, and though not dominant unlike the cardinal dispositions, they are inherited in most people and lay the foundation for our personalities and actions. And unlike this cardinal disposition that is dominating, central dispositions are less dominating, but nevertheless, they mark a person as unique. Kahit na hindi pareha ng cardinal disposition na dominating and super rare, they central dispositions still mark a person as unique. So, an example of central dispositions are kindness, honesty, friendliness, and others. So, that is for the central disposition. So, the third and last level of personal dispositions is the secondary dispositions. These are less conspicuous but far greater in number than central disposition. So, mas marami kaysa sa central disposition yung may secondary dispositions. These are the least characteristic and reliable personal dispositions that appear with some regularity in a person's life. And secondary dispositions are traits that are only present under certain conditions and circumstances. An example of this is public speaking anxiety or impatience while waiting in line. So these examples are only present under certain conditions. So that is why it is called as secondary dispositions. So the personal dispositions are further divided into two parts: the motivational and stylistic dispositions. So motivational dispositions are intensely experienced dispositions, and they receive their motivation from basic needs and drives. It also initiates action, whereas the stylistic dispositions are less intensely experienced and refers to the manner in which an individual behaves. It also guides action. And example of these two are politeness and eating. So politeness is more on a stylistic disposition, whereas eating is more on a motivational disposition. So that is all for the motivational and stylistic dispositions. So the last one is the proprium. These refer to those behaviors and characteristics that people regard as warm, central, and important in their lives. it is not the whole personality. So the proprium is not the whole personality because many characteristics and behaviors of a person are not warm and central, and rather they exist on the periphery of personality. So proprium, ALLPORT preferred the term proprium over self or ego because the latter terms could imply an object or thing within a person that controls behavior, whereas proprium for ALLPORT, it suggests the core of one's personhood. So that is all for proprium, and I guess this ends the discussion about ALLPORT's psychology of the individual. So before we formally end our discussion, let us have a little recap as to what we have discussed a while ago. So dispositional theories are also called as trait theories, and it attempts to explain our personality by identifying our stable characteristics and ways of behaving. So morphogenic science is the study of the individual, whereas nomothetic methods gather data on groups of people. So ALLPORT was eclectic in his acceptance of ideas from a variety of sources. Next is ALLPORT defined personality as the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychophysical systems that determine a person's behavior and thought. Next one is that ALLPORT advocated a proactive position, one that emphasized the notion that people have a large measure of conscious control over their lives. So, ito yung sinabi ko kanina na we are not controlled by our unconsciousness. Rather, we are more on control to our consciousness. So next one, we have here the criteria for psychological healthy people according to ALLPORT. The first one is the extension to the sense of self. Next is the warm relating of self to others. The third is the emotional security or self-acceptance. Fourth is the realistic perception of their environment. Fifth is insight and humor. And lastly, the unifying philosophy of life. So common traits, these are general characteristics held in common by many people, whereas the individual traits are personal dispositions are peculiar to the individual and have the capacity to render different stimuli functional equivalent and to initiate and guide behavior. So we have here the levels of personal dispositions. We have here the cardinal, central, and secondary dispositions. We also have motivational traits. These are also under the personal dispositions that initiate actions. Stylistic traits are also personal dispositions that is guiding actions, which is contrary to the motivational traits that initiate actions. And lastly is the proprium. This refers to those behaviors and personal dispositions that are warm and central to our lives and that we regard them as peculiarly our own. So that is all for today. The continuation of this discussion will be continued by my groupmate Micah Esquimilat. Thank you for listening. God bless.